The phone rang, and my voice sounded tired when I answered it. On the other side, my children, desperate, their words crossed by tears and confusion. "Dad, we saw Mom, with another man, inside our house." My heart stopped for a second, but they continued, every detail of the scene described in rushed sentences and choked with tears. Suddenly, everything went silent around me. My mind spun, refusing to believe those words. I stood there, holding the phone, while they tried to convince me of a reality that seemed impossible. My wife, my partner of so many years, the mother of my children, cheating on me, and in my own home. The place we built together, where we shared memories, dreams, our intertwined lives, now stained by betrayal. I needed proof. Not just from my children's confused and innocent reports, but from something that would lift any trace of doubt from my chest. I remembered my neighbor's security cameras, a system that covered a good portion of the front of my house. Within minutes, I was at his door, trying to control the tone of my voice as I asked for access to recordings from the last few days. He found my request strange. I was always calm, considered, but he soon agreed. Sitting next to him, looking at the monitor, my hands were sweating, and my heart felt like it wanted to rip out of my chest. The screen flickered, accelerated images from the previous days passed by like blurs until, there she was. What I feared most revealed itself in a raw, merciless way, my wife walking through the front door, holding the hand of a man who wasn't me. They laughed, chatted casually. The scene seemed like a cruel parody of what I held sacred. Soon after, they entered the house, as if it were natural. As if he were part of that life. The images continued, and each frame was a stab. My wife and that man walked down the hallway, she whispered something in his ear, he pulled her closer, and even without audio, what happened next was too clear to ignore. She was there, in love, surrendered, in a place that I thought was just mine. Within seconds, they disappeared from the camera's range, leaving behind only the trail of an unbearable betrayal. My mind was chaos. How could she? Who is this man? How long has this been going on? Every question seemed to turn into a scream inside me. I decided that it needed to end. It was the end of anything we had. My children didn't deserve to see their mother like that. I didn't deserve to be betrayed like this. There was no immediate confrontation, there was no shouting. Just the sharp silence of contempt. The next day, I gathered all the evidence, hired a lawyer, and placed the divorce papers in his hands. She tried to explain, tried to rationalize, but the sound of her voice made me sick. "There's nothing to be said," were my only words before walking out the door, leaving behind a life built on falsehood. The decision to move to another country came like a storm. There was no other option. Boston, our city, was now a maze of bitter memories. Every corner, every park, every cafe seemed to remind me of everything I had lost, or rather, everything I never really had. I took my children with me, leaving behind what was left of our house, now an empty place, devoid of any trace of happiness. But what consumed me, more than the end of a marriage, was the deep pain of regret. Not for the divorce, not for the move, but for the time wasted, for the blind trust, for the moments when I ignored signs that now seemed obvious to me. She always arrived late, with banal excuses. "Meeting at work," it said. Or that message that she quickly hid, thinking I wasn't looking. And life wasn't all pain for her. Now, alone, without a husband, she found herself completely isolated. Our children avoided her, refusing all contact, leaving her messages unanswered, her calls ignored. She tried to rebuild, tried to find solace in the man she cheated on me with, but even he disappeared when he realized she had nothing left to offer but a shattered life. The silence of an empty home is deafening. And for her, the days became like solitary prisons, as she desperately tried to hold on to any trace of what was left of our family. "You don't understand," she told her children, tears streaming down her face. But they understood perfectly. They understood that the love she claimed to have was just another farce, a reflection of the betrayal that destroyed our family. I, now in a new country, far from everything and everyone, started to rebuild my life. Every day was a struggle, but also a victory. I felt like, for the first time in years, I could breathe. I was free from pain, free from deceit, and I could focus on the only thing that mattered, starting over. But in the meantime, there she was, alone, regretful, staring into an abyss of loneliness. Every attempt at reconciliation with our children was like a knife that cut deep, because there was no going back, there was no forgiveness. And while I moved forward, trying to find a new path, she found herself trapped by her own choices. And in the midst of all this, the question arises that echoes in the void: is repentance enough to erase the mistakes of the past? Or, sometimes, does destiny have more cruel karmas than we can imagine? And that's how the story begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal, as we know how much it destroys lives, families and souls. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a powerful message: betrayal is devastating and has consequences. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of twists and emotions. Now, take a deep breath, adjust the volume, and get ready to hear a shocking story that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Good story. The sound of the sea, the salty air, and the laughter echoing across the beach that summer seemed too perfect not to be eternal. Thomas and Evelyn met like so many other couples, in a setting worthy of romance. He is an architect with dreams of creating his own office. She, a teacher passionate about literature and the possibilities that life offered. Their meeting was something simple, but it enveloped them like a storm, fast, intense and absolutely inevitable. Soon, they were inseparable. It wasn't long before they got married and bought a house together, a beautiful Victorian building, full of charm and stories hidden within its old walls. Their routine was the routine of many: work, responsibilities, a comfortable life over the years. But unlike many, they seemed to be always connected, sharing confidences at the end of a long day, cuddling on the couch with a glass of wine or simply lying side by side, feeling each other's warmth. The love seemed secure, unshakable. Over time, children came: Dylan and Clara. 2 children who lit up the house and transformed that couple relationship into something bigger, a family. Each achievement of the little ones was celebrated as if it were their own victory, and the challenges that parenthood brought seemed to be faced together, as a united team, ready to overcome any obstacle. Thomas was a dedicated father, always present. He tried to balance his work with his life at home, something that, although challenging, always seemed worth it when he saw his children's smiles or when Evelyn laid her head on his shoulder, with a sigh of satisfaction and love. Evelyn, on the other hand, was that mother who gave of herself completely, who lost herself in games, in bedtime stories, and who, at the same time, kept the flame of her marriage alive, surprising Thomas with small gestures, intimate moments for 2, words of affection that made him remember how it all began. But while Thomas dedicated his nights to work and providing a comfortable life for them all, Evelyn seemed to slowly change. She became more introspective, her gaze became longer, more thoughtful. There was something in his eyes that was lost, as if he was searching for an answer that no one could give. Sometimes she would disappear into the painting studio that Thomas built for her in the backyard, where she would spend hours staring at blank canvases, as if each brushstroke was an attempt to translate the troubled feelings that were bubbling inside her. When he asked her what was going on, she just smiled, with that smile that Thomas loved so much, and said, "Nothing, darling. Just thinking about life." And it was true. Evelyn thought about life. She thought about the dreams that were lost along the way, about the decisions that led her there, in that perfect house, with a perfect family, but still, something seemed missing. Something that not even she could understand, but that increasingly weighed on her chest. Sometimes at night, while Thomas slept next to her, she would wake up and stare at the ceiling, wondering if this life was really the one she had chosen or if she had simply been carried along by the flow of things, without ever stopping to question. Even with these thoughts, she dedicated herself to her family, doing the best she could to make everyone around her happy. He prepared Sunday lunches like no one else. He made a point of being present at every important moment in Dylan and Clara's lives, always hugging his children when they needed it most. And the relationship with Thomas still had its shining moments, unexpected walks, candlelit dinners, the two of them dancing in the kitchen while preparing a meal together. But there was tension. An invisible tension that seemed to haunt the calmest moments and that Thomas, no matter how hard he tried, couldn't ignore it. He loved her deeply and believed that whatever dark cloud hung over Evelyn would pass in time. Ups and downs were part of life, he told himself. He just needed to be there and be the support she could always find. However, Evelyn felt increasingly trapped within herself. Thomas, always so present, seemed not to see the small cracks that were growing in his heart. Maybe he was too distracted by work. Maybe he was too trusting that the love they had was enough to overcome anything. And maybe Evelyn knew that, but even so, she couldn't get rid of the feeling of emptiness that dominated her. The children's school was a place of refuge for Evelyn. She liked to get involved in activities, to participate in parent meetings, to feel useful in some way. And it was at one of these meetings that she met someone who, without realizing it, awakened something in her that had been dormant for a long time. A different presence, a conversation that wasn't about children, work or bills to pay. Someone who made her feel seen, interesting, wanted. From then on, small changes began to emerge in Evelyn's behavior. She started to tidy up more, to pay attention to details that previously didn't catch her attention. Thomas noticed these changes, but preferred to think that they were just phases, like all the others they had faced together. She must be feeling better about herself, he thought, trying to look for the positive side of everything. Meanwhile, Evelyn started looking for something she couldn't find at home. Something that she barely knew what it was, but that, when she was far away, seemed to become clearer. As if the world around you started to have more color, more life. She didn't want to hurt Thomas, that was never in her plans. But, little by little, her me-time escapades became more frequent, more intense. The children sensed that something was out of place, but they were too young to understand the depth of what was happening. For them, Evelyn was the mother who always took care of everything, the mother who was present at every school event, who hugged them in difficult times. But they also saw her distant look, the way she avoided certain family moments. Clara, the eldest daughter, once asked Thomas, "Dad, is Mommy sad?" And he, not knowing how to respond, just ran his hand through her hair and smiled, saying that everything would be fine. That was a world that Evelyn didn't want to collapse, but it was also a world that, for her, no longer made sense. And, while Thomas fought to maintain the family's stability, without knowing the secrets that Evelyn hid in her chest, she found herself increasingly distant, lost in a maze of choices and desires that she never imagined she had. And the studio at the back of the house became his refuge. His paintings began to change, more chaotic lines, darker colors, shapes that expressed something he couldn't say in words. And every time Thomas went in there to try to talk, she hid the canvases, as if those brushstrokes were confessions that he couldn't see. But everything seemed to be fine. In the eyes of their neighbors, their friends, their school, they were a happy family, an exemplary couple. However, like any well-built facade, behind the walls there was something about to crumble. And while Evelyn continued her silent search for something more, Thomas remained blind to what was coming. Their story was just beginning to unfold. The days continued to pass, as if nothing was out of place, but there was something in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible change that slowly undermined the family's peace. Thomas continued his routine, trying hard to maintain the stability and love that had always existed between him, Evelyn and the children. The nights were a mix of nostalgia and hope, as he tried to rekindle the flame that seemed to have gone out. Little surprises, dinners at restaurants she liked, sweet notes left on the bathroom mirror. He did everything to see that smile again, the smile that made his days have meaning. But Evelyn was distant. She responded to Thomas's attempts with automatic kindness, almost as if she were fulfilling a role. Her responses were polite but empty. And when he hugged her, he felt like she wasn't there, her body present, but her mind somewhere unreachable. She started leaving the house more, claiming she needed space, time to breathe, to reconnect with herself. "I just need time to think," he said with a lost look, avoiding Thomas's eyes as he packed his bag and walked out the door. Evelyn's absences became frequent. The painting studio became a constant excuse, as did meetings with friends. Thomas was suspicious, yes. I felt in the pit of my stomach that something was wrong, but I preferred not to confront the problem. I preferred to believe it was just a phase, a cloud that would pass. He thought that the love he felt for her would be enough to overcome any challenge, but time proved otherwise. What Thomas didn't know was that Evelyn had already made a decision. She was looking for something that she couldn't find within those walls, something that would make her feel alive again. And that something took shape in the presence of that man he met at school meetings, Ethan. A charismatic man, sure of himself, and who, in Evelyn's eyes, seemed to see a part of her that not even she knew. Casual conversations evolved into exchanging glances, and soon, to meetings outside school hours, coffees in out-of-the-way places, dinners in places where no one would recognize them. At first, Evelyn resisted. She felt guilty, torn between the life she had built and her desire to explore something that seemed so different from what she knew. But Ethan knew how to engage her, he knew what to say to make her feel like she was the most special woman in the world, someone who deserved more than the monotonous life she led. And Evelyn allowed herself to be seduced by this idea, by this false promise that she could have something new, something exciting. The escapades became more daring, to the point where Evelyn decided to take Ethan to her own home. That place that had once been the symbol of her love for Thomas, now became the scene of betrayal. The painting studio, a secluded extension of the house, was the perfect place for their secret meetings. She felt protected there, hidden from her children's eyes and, especially, from Thomas's eyes. And while Evelyn lived her internal dilemma, trying to balance her double life, Thomas began to realize that the holes in the family routine were becoming too big to ignore. Evelyn's excuses started to sound repetitive, and he noticed the rush with which she got ready to go out, the excessive care she took with her appearance, the sparkle in her eyes that he no longer saw when they were together. A feeling of fear and helplessness took over him, but still, Thomas tried to convince himself that it was nothing. That maybe he was imagining things. That it was all a passing phase. Until, one night, when he was alone at home, he received a call from his children. Clara's desperate voice was the only thing he could hear, drowned out by crying in confusion. "Dad, Mom. Mom is with another man, in our house." Thomas froze. Each word was like a sharp blade piercing his heart. And when Clara passed the phone to Dylan, he confirmed, "We saw it, Dad. They were in there, together." Thomas's mind refused to believe, to process what he was hearing. But something inside him knew. He knew that what he had tried to ignore for so long had finally revealed itself. He knew something was out of control, and that he needed to act. The most logical thought that came to his mind was to check his neighbor's security cameras, hoping that maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a friend, someone he didn't know. Maybe his children had misinterpreted everything. But, upon arriving at his neighbor's house and seeing the images, Thomas realized that there was no mistake. There was Evelyn, walking through the front door with Ethan, hand in hand, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They laughed, exchanged glances, and disappeared into the house, the place where Thomas thought his love was safe, the place where he built his entire life with Evelyn. It was true. Evelyn was cheating on Thomas. And all the trust he placed in her, all the love he had for his wife, everything crumbled there, before his eyes. Chaos was beginning to take shape, but there was still more to come. And as Thomas tried to comprehend the magnitude of that betrayal, an even greater revelation was about to emerge, one that would forever change the course of their lives. Thomas stared at his neighbor's monitor for a few seconds longer, but it felt like an eternity. What he had just seen changed everything, his perception of life, his marriage, his understanding of what was real. He thanked his neighbor, albeit with empty words, and left the house in silence, his face hard, his eyes cold, trying to maintain his composure. Each step towards his own door was heavier than the last, as if gravity had suddenly increased and he could barely support the weight of his own feet. As he entered the house, the stillness hit him like a blow. A bitter stillness that made him feel the emptiness that was to come. He looked at Evelyn's studio, where she spent hours upon hours painting, or, as he now knew, doing something much more devastating. He felt the tears building up, but he suppressed them. "I couldn't cry, not now." He picked up the phone, looked at her number on the screen and hesitated. His mind was torn: confront Evelyn immediately or wait until he saw her face to face, looked her straight in the eye, and demanded the truth. He chose to wait. Thomas knew she would come back at some point, and he needed that eye-to-eye conversation. He needed the brutal honesty that could only be found in direct confrontation. He needed to feel every word, every justification, and know if there was any spark of remorse in the woman he swore to love for life. It was then that he heard the door open. Evelyn entered the house, dropping her bag and walking casually to the kitchen, without imagining that Thomas was already there. When she saw him standing there, leaning against the counter, his keys in his hand, his eyebrows furrowed, she hesitated for a moment. The tension in the air was palpable, and she felt something was wrong. "Thomas, are you okay?" Evelyn asked, with a tone of voice that tried to sound casual, but betrayed the uncertainty welling up in her chest. He remained silent for a few seconds, staring at her, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions that threatened to come out in the form of screams. "I know, Evelyn," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "I know about you, and him." The words hung in the air like a sharp blade about to cut through any illusion of normality. Evelyn's face instantly paled, her hands shook, and she took a step back, leaning on the kitchen counter. What are you saying?" His voice broke, and his eyes widened as he tried to find a way out, an excuse that could explain, a lie that could save. "There's no point in lying, I saw it. I saw everything on the neighbor's cameras. I saw you come in here with him. I saw you two, together." Thomas could no longer hold back the tears that burned his eyes, and his voice became increasingly choked. "How could you do that? Why?" The pressure of the whole situation made Evelyn bow, as if she were shrinking from her own mistakes. She knew there was no longer any way to escape. The mask he had worn for so long was finally shattered, and the whole truth was there, naked and cruel, before them. "Thomas, I don't know what to say." She approached him, her hand outstretched, but he retreated, as if her touch were something corrosive. "I know you must be feeling very angry right now, but it's not that simple, isn't it that simple?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "You destroyed our family, our children, our life, and you tell me it's not that simple." Evelyn didn't know what to answer. Her mind was in chaos, but deep down she knew there was something that needed to be said. Something that had been hidden for a long time, a truth that would not only reveal the reasons for her betrayal, but also the depths of the pain she had been carrying. She took a long breath, trying to compose herself, trying to find the right words. "Thomas, I never wanted you to find out like this. I never wanted any of this to happen. But, there's something I need to tell you. Something I kept hidden for a long time, and I can't bear to carry it alone anymore." He stared at her, confused and furious. "What else can you tell me, Evelyn? Isn't what you did enough?" "No, it's not enough, because the truth is, when you were at work, when you were busy trying to give us everything we have, I felt completely alone. As if you left us, as if you left me. I felt invisible, Thomas. As if I weren't important to you anymore, as if you didn't see me anymore." Thomas was silent for a moment. That confession was like a knife cutting deep, hitting not only his anger, but his own view of himself, of his role as a husband and father. But that didn't explain the betrayal. Nothing could explain it. Is that your justification? Because she felt alone, decided to destroy everything? It doesn't make sense, Evelyn. I loved you, I did everything for you, for our children. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to find the strength to continue. I know, Thomas. And I loved you too. I still love you. But there's something you don't know, and maybe it won't change how you feel right now, but it's something I need to say. She approached him, tears streaming down her face. The man you saw me with, Ethan, he is Dylan and Clara's father. The shock of those words hit Thomas like a punch in the gut. His mind simply refused to process. What? What are you saying? Evelyn swallowed hard, her voice shaking, the words coming out with effort. Many years ago, before we got married, I had an affair with him. A case that I thought was buried, that I never thought would come back. But when I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know whose children they were. And I decided to tell you that they were yours. I thought he was out of my life forever, but he came back, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Thomas was left breathless, his hands shaking, his face hot with anger and despair. You lied to me this whole time. Made me believe I was the father of our children. I didn't want to hurt you, Thomas. I wanted our family to be real. And, in a way, it was. You were always a wonderful father to them, you were always there, a gift for children who weren't mine. Thomas screamed, his voice echoing through the house as tears of anger and pain burned his eyes. You deceived me, betrayed me, and now you tell me that Dylan and Clara, they are not your biological children, Evelyn added, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with guilt and sadness. But they were always your children at heart, Thomas. You were their father in every way that matters. And I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I was desperate. When Ethan came back, everything I had hidden, everything I had tried to bury, came back with him. And I was weak. I let everything get lost. Thomas walked away, staggering into the living room. He couldn't think, he couldn't breathe. He felt betrayed, crushed by the weight of an entire life built on lies. The truth about his family, about his wife, about his own identity as a father, everything fell apart in a matter of seconds. Evelyn, standing in the kitchen, sobbed almost inaudibly, knowing that nothing she said could repair the damage she had caused. All she could do was watch helplessly as the man she loved was consumed by irreparable pain. Thomas didn't know what to do. The camera images, Evelyn's brutal revelation, the idea that her children might never have been hers, everything swirled in her mind like an endless whirlpool. He grabbed his car keys, without saying anything else, and walked out the door, leaving Evelyn behind, lost in her regret. In the silence of that house, only the marks of a broken family remained, of a love that was lost amid secrets and lies. Thomas drove aimlessly for what seemed like an interminable amount of time. The landscape blurred around him, but he saw nothing. Everything he saw was inside his mind, a jumble of memories, secrets and hurt. Every second of Evelyn's revelation echoed over and over again, and he could only hear her voice saying those devastating words, Dylan and Clara are not your biological children. It was as if all the life he knew had been ripped from beneath his feet, and he was falling, not knowing where or how he would land. He parked the car in an empty park, where there was no one, and turned off the engine. The night was silent, but his head was a whirlwind of thoughts, a chaos that he couldn't order. Thomas knew he needed to think, needed to understand what to do next. But every attempt to rationalize was interrupted by the crushing weight of the betrayal, of the lie that permeated every year of his life. He closed his eyes and pressed his hands against the steering wheel, as if that could contain the pain that was rising in his throat, threatening to swallow him whole. Meanwhile, Evelyn stayed at home, paralyzed. She felt there was nothing more to be done, that all bridges had been burned. The silence that fell over the house after Thomas left seemed to mock her, to mock all the time she pretended, all the time she believed she was somehow doing her best. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the picture frames scattered around the room, images of a family she had destroyed. Her chest was tight, her heart was pounding, and she wondered, almost desperately, what would happen next. But what tormented her more than anything was the question she didn't want to silence: would Thomas tell Dylan and Clara the truth? Would he reveal to them that the entire story about his family, his origins, was a lie? She knew that it would not only affect her relationship with Thomas, but it would destroy what the children believed was their story, their identity. And as a mother, Evelyn couldn't bear the thought of her children suffering because of her choices. Thomas knew he needed to make a decision. He parked back home late at night, his face lined with exhaustion and pain, but with cold determination in his eyes. Upon entering, he found Evelyn still sitting in the living room, hugging her arms, as if she were trying to protect herself from something invisible. She looked at him hopefully, as if he might have returned with a forgiveness she knew she didn't deserve. "We need to talk," he said, emotionlessly. Evelyn just nodded, not knowing what to expect. "I'm going to talk to our children," Thomas began, voice firm. "But not in the way you're thinking. They don't need to know all this dirt. They don't need to know that I might not be their biological father." Evelyn blinked in surprise. "Aren't you going to tell them?" "I will tell you that we are separating, yes. They deserve to know our marriage is over. But I won't destroy them, Evelyn. They are not to blame for any of this." He paused, eyes fixed on her. "Dylan and Clara will continue to be my children. I created them, I loved them, and nothing you did will change that. But that's all they'll know." Evelyn let out a breath she didn't even know she was holding. A mixture of relief and pain hit her, and she didn't know how to process what she felt. She wanted to thank Thomas, but she knew this was much more than a rational decision. It was his last act of love and sacrifice, not for her, but for the children he always considered his own. And Evelyn knew that was a kind of kindness she would never be able to repay. Thomas stood up, his expression unwavering. "I'll talk to them tomorrow morning. I want you to leave the house before then. I need them to hear it from me, and me alone." Evelyn just nodded, without the strength to argue, without the strength to insist on anything. She slowly stood up and walked to her room, feeling the weight of each step, knowing that these would be the last hours she would spend in that house, a house that she had turned into a scene of betrayal. While she packed her things, silent and lost, Thomas went to his children's rooms, one at a time. He opened Clara's door and found her sleeping, with a peace that seemed impossible at that point. He stood still for a few seconds, watching her breathe calmly, and a single tear fell from his face. He felt unable to bear the thought of missing those moments, of not being there for them as he always had been. He closed the door carefully, and went to Dylan's room, who was sleeping soundly, his body curled up as if he was dreaming of something good. Thomas whispered, "I love you," that was lost in the silence of the house. The next morning, Evelyn left early. She looked at the house one last time before closing the door behind her, and all she could feel was overwhelming regret. It was the end of everything she had known, and the beginning of a lonely journey, weighed down by the weight of her choices. When Thomas woke Dylan and Clara up, they realized something was wrong. Their father's serious expressions, their mother's absence, none of it made sense to them. Sitting at the kitchen table, they listened to Thomas explain, in the calmest voice he could muster, that he and Evelyn had decided to separate. He told them directly, but without details that could hurt them more than necessary. They cried, they rebelled, they asked why, in every way they could, but Thomas just repeated that it was a difficult decision, but that it wouldn't change the love he felt for them. And that, as difficult as it was to understand now, they would overcome it together. Evelyn spent the next few days away, in silence, avoiding any direct contact with Thomas or the children. The distance was unbearable, but she knew she had to accept the consequences of her actions. She knew that her place in that family was irretrievably lost, and the only thing she could do now was try to find some peace with herself, however distant that seemed. And so, what was once a united family, a happy family, fell apart into a web of secrets, wrong choices, and a truth that, even revealed, would remain buried in the silence of those who chose to protect what they loved. The betrayal left deep marks, but it also brought to light dilemmas that they would never have imagined facing. But how would all this end? What did the future hold for Thomas, Evelyn, Dylan, and Clara, now that the truth had come to light and the past could no longer be erased? That was the question hanging over them as they walked into an uncertain and unpredictable future. The months passed, and the silence that took over the lives of Thomas, Evelyn, Dylan, and Clara seemed to have been the only way to survive the chaos they had experienced. The official separation happened quickly, as civilly as possible, but everyone's lives were far from the same. The relationship between the members of that shattered family transformed, taking forms that none of them could have predicted. Thomas dedicated himself to his children, trying to maintain a routine that brought stability. Mornings were always the same, breakfast together, conversations about the day's plans, carpools to school. He tried hard to show that despite everything, there was still love and there was still a family to be maintained. He tried as much as possible to prevent Dylan and Clara from feeling Evelyn's absence too deeply, but the weight of lies and betrayal still hung over them. And although he decided not to reveal the children's true paternity, this secret became a constant shadow in his mind. The children, in turn, experienced the impact of the divorce on their own skin. Dylan increasingly closed himself off, immersing himself in his studies and sports to escape any talk about his mother. He was too young to understand the full depth of the separation, but old enough to feel there was something that wasn't being said. Clara, the most sensitive, felt lost. Her connection to her mother had always been strong, and now it was as if part of it had been ripped away. She made calls to Evelyn, crying, trying to understand why things had ended this way, and each of these conversations seemed to fuel her mother's feelings of guilt more. Evelyn found herself isolated, separated from her children and the life she built with Thomas. She tried to start a new life, away from her old home, away from all the memories that now weighed her down like stones. Guilt and regret were constant companions. She desperately wanted a way to reconnect with her children, to rebuild whatever relationship was possible. But every time she tried, she encountered an invisible barrier, a distance that she herself created with her choices. For her, it was as if she were living a daily punishment, the reality that all of her actions had led not only to the end of her marriage, but to the distance from those she loved most. It was during a scheduled visit, months after the divorce, that Evelyn finally faced the reality of her new relationship with Dylan and Clara. When she arrived at the new house where Thomas lived with them, she was greeted with an icy silence. Dylan, who was always so close to her, could barely look his mother in the eye. Clara was there, but her look was distant, lost. "We're fine, Mom." "Better than you think," was all Dylan could say. And that hit Evelyn like a punch. There was no more room for her there, their lives moved on, and she was left behind. In that moment, she realized that the family she once knew was irreparably changed. She left in tears, knowing that any hope of a full reconciliation was lost. Thomas, even with all the pain, began to find something he never expected: peace. Evelyn's estrangement brought a clarity he hadn't had since before their marriage, a clarity about who he was, about the kind of life he wanted to lead. He realized that he had spent years trying to please, trying to be the perfect husband and father, always fearing that he wouldn't be enough. But without Evelyn by his side, he was able to reconnect with himself and his children in a truer way. Nights that were once filled with the emptiness of an unhappy marriage have now become moments of tranquility. Thomas began to explore new hobbies, new friendships, and even, little by little, make space for the idea that maybe, one day, he could love again. And the secret of Dylan and Clara's paternity remained kept. For Thomas, there was no point in revealing a truth that would only cause pain, a truth that would not change the love he had for his children and that they had for him. But that decision also meant living with a moral dilemma that would stay with him forever. The lie was there, like a hidden crack beneath the surface of their lives, something that could never be completely fixed, but that he chose to ignore to protect what was left of the good. Evelyn, in turn, tried to find a way to move forward. She sought therapy, reconnected with friends she had lost over time, and began focusing on art as a way to deal with her own pain. Each canvas she painted was a piece of herself that she tried to understand and accept. At some point, she tried to seek her children's forgiveness, but whenever she seemed close to achieving it, something pulled her back, an invisible barrier that showed that certain mistakes could not be repaired with words alone. Time passed, and life settled down differently for each of them. Thomas found stability in a new sense of purpose, dedicating himself to his children and his own growth. Dylan and Clara continued with their lives, with the marks of a difficult divorce, but also with the certainty that they were loved. And Evelyn. Evelyn found a new way of living, without the security of a family, but with the courage to finally confront the demons she carried. In the end, betrayal destroyed, but also transformed. Thomas and Evelyn's marriage was a tragedy, but it was also a journey of self-discovery, forgiveness, or lack thereof, and impossible choices. A family broken, but not completely lost. And life went on for everyone, in ways they could never have imagined. What did you think of this story? Did the character choices surprise you? Leave your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Remember, the channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Our stories show how it destroys lives and leaves irreversible scars. Thanks for following along, and see you in the next story.